Hello, my name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. I'm really excited about today's briefing as we're going to dive deeper into a fascinating topic, state Supreme Courts. Now, one question we get asked about pretty frequently here at Ballotpedia is, how do I learn more about state courts? And we hope that these next 20 to 25 minutes will help you do just that and introduce you to some recent analyses and reports that we've done on this. So last summer, we completed the first phase of a study to discern the partisan balance on each of the 52 courts of last resort here in the United States. And to do that, we evaluated the extent to which each state Supreme Court justice in the United States was affiliated with either the Democratic or Republican parties within that state at the time of their selection to the court. But that was just one phase of this work. We next set out to discern the partisan balance on each court in a project titled Determiners and Dissenters. And here we examined how these justices decided the cases that came before them in 2020. Which justices ruled together most often? Which ones frequently dissented? And which courts featured the most unanimous versus contentious decisions? As you can see, this was a very complex and fascinating task. And to help explain all of this is one of the lead authors of this study. Sam Postel is a former staff writer on Ballotpedia's Marquee team. He now works in our external relations department. He is also a lecturer at the University of Dallas and is currently working on a book on the 19th century Congress and legislative statesmanship. So thank you so much for joining me today, Sam.
Thanks so much, Dave. I really appreciate that kind introduction. Yeah, this project is a long time coming, and I'm really excited to share our findings, and I'm really excited to get it on the site. So just a little bit of background to put on top of what Dave said. This was a two-phase project. The first phase was called Ballotpedia Courts State Partisanship. And like Dave said, we looked at all of the justices across all of the courts of last resort across all of the states. And what we did was we gathered all of the partisan data that was available on all of those justices. We put it into spreadsheets because people at Ballotpedia love spreadsheets. And then we took all of that data that was in the spreadsheets and we put it into a formula that we created. What we got as a result of this was a confidence score, a partisan confidence score for each justice. And those confidence scores ranged from strong Democrat to mild Democrat to indeterminate to mild Republican to strong Republican. So we got kind of a partisan background for each justice who was on the court as of June 15th, 2020. That was 341 justices at the time because there were a few vacancies. There's usually 345 across all the states. But we quickly realized this wasn't the full story about what was going on in the state courts. So we conducted phase two. And phase two is what I'm going to talk to you all about today. And what that dealt with was looking at the actual decisions and figuring out how the justices ruled together, whether that be a mild Democrat with a strong Democrat or a mild Democrat with a strong Republican, and so on and so forth. So again, we set out to create another spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet had to do with reading all of the cases decided across all of the courts of last resort in 2020. For those of you keeping track at home, that was 8,303 cases that we read. From there, we basically charted where each justice ruled in each one of those cases, and we tried to figure out who ruled with one another most frequently and what sort of majorities and minorities were on the court. So we came up with 4 categories from that research project, and the 4 categories that we identified for the courts where the patterns made sense were opinion partners, so that's when 2 justices rule together frequently, a dissenting minority, so that's the minority on the court who rules together in split cases most frequently, a determining majority, which is the majority who frequently rules together in split cases on the court, and then my favorite, the lone dissenter, who is the one rogue justice who's constantly dissenting and fighting against everybody on the court in cases where there's only one dissent on a single case. So that's a summary of basically what we did. So let's get into the nuts and bolts. I think.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, that's a great introduction to basically how you did what you did. But, you know, as this slide asks, why did we do this research?
Yeah, so there's several reasons why one would set out to do this crazy and intensive project on the courts. The first, so I'll give you two practical reasons and two more philosophic reasons. The first reason is that these elections are not all that transparent and they're always at the bottom of the ballot. And the result is that voters don't have a whole lot of information on this and they often go neglected. But as we saw in the 2020 election, these courts, they decide really important questions. A question that the Colorado court just took up was whether or not law enforcement can spy on you without a warrant, and whether they can use all of the means at their disposal to do so. So this is an important question for our day-to-day lives. A second practical question is, or a second practical reason is that the last time that such a study was done was in 2012 by a group of researchers funded through Stanford, and it was called the CF scoring study, or campaign finance scoring study. And what they did was they gathered all of the data on campaign finance surrounding judicial elections in the states. And we were relying on a lot of their data and a lot of their scores, but a lot of it was out of date. So we really wanted to provide some more up-to-date information for our readers. Now, some more philosophic reasons why we did this is that most people have seen the Greek goddess of justice, blindfolded, a sword in one hand, and then the scales of justice in the other, assuming that a justice or justice itself is blind, right? And therefore, a justice shouldn't see the parties before him or her when he or she goes to decide a case, but should only hear the arguments and decide on the basis of those arguments. We have something similar ensconced in front of the United States Supreme Court building in this Contemplation of Justice statue. And what we see here is a female justice looking at that icon, holding that icon and contemplating it in one hand, presumably hoping to live up to that image of justice with the book of law under her other hand. So we wanted to see, is this really the practice of things at the state court level? And then another philosophic reason is that we have a judicial code of conduct for United States judges. And we wanted to see if the state court justices lived up to this. So Canon 3 of that code reads, "A judge should perform the duties of office fairly, impartially, and diligently." Yet these justices are elected. So how easy is it to stay impartial when you're reliant on election? Can you be blind to the parties before you if you're going to be up for election? How much does that play into the decisions that you make? And then even more perhaps condemning of these justices who participate in partisan elections is that a judge should refrain from political activity, states Canon 5. Well, at the state court level, this is kind of baked into the cake, right? Several states use partisan elections. The majority of states use elections. So by the nature of the position itself, you are not refraining from political activity. In fact, the opposite. You have to be political in order to get the office. So we wanted to see how this sort of pieced together.
Yeah, it's interesting the difference between, you highlight a bunch of different things here, but the differences between federal and state justices and in terms of how they're selected. And then I guess there's also another aspect of this, and that is that when we talk about partisanship, when we talk about it in terms of members of Congress or members of the state legislature, it's probably quite a bit different than what we're talking about when we're talking about, partisanly elected judges, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly the same kind of rhetoric that is spoken around partisan election for legislators, but largely this just comes in hand with the election process, I think. But it is very different, right? It's not linear in terms of what party is a justice from and how is that justice going to rule, as we'll see throughout this presentation and as you can see throughout the study itself. So my argument is that there's actually a lot more that goes into understanding a justice than merely understanding the letter that comes before or after his or her name.
Yeah, definitely. All right, let's jump into it with some examples, shall we?
Yeah. So before we set out to do all this research, what we did was we read all we could get our hands on about the state Supreme Court justices. And I came up with a hypothesis very quickly. All the things that I read said very similar things. And that was that you could track a straight line from the R or the D behind the justice's name to the way that justice would behave on the court. So my hypothesis after reading all of this stuff and preparing for this study was that the courts could look either like a cudgel or it could look like complete chaos. So as for the cudgel argument, I kind of thought the courts were going to look like, once I got into studying them, the Roman Senate in 64 BC. This is how a lot of these courts were portrayed when you read the news about them. So you have this picture here of Cicero chastising Catiline, who he had defeated in an election, and exposing him and his conspiracy to all of the Roman people. I thought that, well, you know, these are political elections, they get heated, and naturally what's going to happen is someone who loses, or the party who loses, is going to be put in their place by the winner of the election, a sort of winner take all scenario. This is what all of the writing that was out there led me to believe about these courts. And as for the chaos, I assumed that if you get politics involved in matters of justice, then it would look something like what happened in the United States House of Representatives in 1798 between our friends Matthew Lyon from Vermont and Roger Griswold from Connecticut. The story behind this is that Mr. Griswold called Mr. Lyon a coward. And what ensued was that tobacco juice was spit from one mouth into one eye. And there's a 2-week-long trial within the House of Representatives in 1798, deciding whether who should be kicked out of the House or who shouldn't. Well, nothing was decided after two long weeks. And Mr. Griswold was somewhat upset about the way that things played out. So he came in with a hickory walking cane and started attacking Matthew Lyon before the entire House. So I figured that once you get politics involved in things like this, and you get the mud spattering that comes about through elections, I figured that it'd be very difficult to have a sort of impartial procession of justice within the courts. So that was my hypothesis.
Well, I'm guessing that, by the way, you're presenting both of those, that was your hypothesis, but things turned out to be probably a lot more complicated and a lot more involved than either of those two simplistic, examples would show, right?
Yeah, so our results were somewhat different. This is our conclusion to the study, and these are the two big takeaways that I found. And they're general, and they're not perfect rules because things do get complicated. But I came away from the study with this sort of takeaway. Although justices sometimes fall into ruling patterns that follow partisanship and partisanship history in the courts, and although split courts do tend to fall into somewhat predictable majority and minorities with the exclusion of certain justices who depart from their partisans, there are notable exceptions. So the first is that on many courts, at least one justice frequently allied with those who recorded a conflicting partisan history or a conflicting partisanship score, a confidence score from our first study. That was very interesting, right? Frequently, we saw someone who was a strong Republican go over and rule with Democrats. Frequently, we saw someone who was pinned in the news as a Democrat rule with Republicans. So it wasn't all that simplistic. And furthermore, issues matter, right? So there can be a justice who's a Republican who's really sympathetic with Democrats on a certain issue. So that's one takeaway. Another takeaway is that on a court composed of justices of the same party, those justices fight all the time. So maybe the chaos mold kind of fits there, but I was very surprised at the tendency of justices all of the same party to still not be able to agree. I figured that if you had a court stacked with justices all from one party, then you would just have unanimity across all of the cases, but that just wasn't the case.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it's really reassuring that the work that you did kind of bears that out. I mean, we talk about in the brew from time to time when certain decisions get handed down from the U.S. Supreme Court, and there's always this surprise that not every decision is split completely on ideological lines, and sometimes those groups of people who decide on one side or the other changes, and it's really fascinating. But it also, I think, speaks to the really specific and sometimes very particular points of law that are being discussed here, and that it's not a real pure ideological decision. A lot of it is really focusing on that justice's view of the law or their interpretation of how that particular sentence is being applied in those particular cases. I know you had some really interesting look at Wisconsin's election cases. So Do you want to jump into those?
Yeah, but before that, I want to emphasize along your point of the similarity between the federal and the state courts, what we saw as opposed to cudgel or chaos was something that looked a lot more like the relationship we saw between Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia. I like to say the state courts look a lot more like Scalia and Ginsburg riding an elephant than Lyon and Griswold or Catiline and Cicero. But yeah, let's get into some examples really quickly.
Yeah, well, and it's probably a good thing that things look a lot more like Alito and or Scalia and Ginsburg, because you're right, there would be either chaos or a cudgel.
Yeah, absolutely. So an interesting example that I pulled out of the report is Wisconsin. So Wisconsin seems like it was a suspect court for a lot of reasons, right? And it was an interesting court. One reason that it was interesting was that there was a very partisan election, right? We had a Justice Kelly, who was appointed by a Republican governor, which seemed to, in many people's eyes, solidify the Republican majority on the court. Daniel Kelly went up for retention election against Joe Karofsky, a Democrat. And he ends up losing his seat halfway through the year to Jill Karofsky. But it would still seem that there's a Republican majority on the court. A lot of people peg Patience Roggensack as a Republican. Ann Walsh Bradley, a lot of people peg her as a Democrat. So what our confidence score breakdown had of the court was when Kelly was on the court, 4 justices who were Republican, 1 justice who was a Democrat, and 2 justices who was indeterminate. So it would seem somewhat predictable, right? You would think that the Republicans would have the court pretty well in hand, even when Kelly left. That just wasn't the case when we looked at the cases from 2020. So what you see 1 justice, a strong Republican, Justice Hagedorn, who had participated in Republican political causes. You see him frequently allying with the Democrats on the court. And after Karofsky gets on the court, you see the Democrats actually holding a majority with Hagedorn on their side. The best way to look at this is the election-related cases from Wisconsin, which garnered a lot of attention in 2020. So I've pulled all of the election-related cases and the way that the court broke down on those cases. And what you can see is Justice Hagedorn, a strong Republican, actually allied with the Democrats in every single case but 1 when we look at election cases. So very fascinating. And I didn't predict that something like this would happen. But from all of the partisan data that we could gather on Hagedorn, he seemed like the second strongest Republican on the court, next to Kelly. So it was very fascinating to see that happen.
Yeah, what was really interesting for some background there is that Hagedorn was elected in 2019 in what was an incredibly close election, very, very tight margin. But you're right. I think all of what we expected when we were covering that is that he was, obviously more Republican than his rulings showed out to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So the takeaway from this is that, again, as you mentioned before, Dave, partisanship it's not linear to ideology, right? And certainly it can play out differently in different cases, right? Different subjects before the court matter.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, as you mentioned before, some issues, cause a different alignment depending on what the issue is.
That's right.
All right. So then I think you have another example where you look at 2 states that you think would be completely different, but they're really not so much.
Yeah. So the next example is Indiana and Washington, right? 2 very different states. Indiana is a red state and Washington is a blue state if we look at presidential elections and most other things about these states, right? So you would think that they'd be very different. So if you look at Indiana's state Supreme Court, you have all Republican justices on the court. And they're all mild Republicans except for 1 strong Republican justice. So what would you think about this court? Well, your assumption would be that they would all just get along. There wouldn't be a whole lot of argument. They would just decide all of the cases 5-0. That wasn't the case. When you look at the numbers, you see that the Indiana Supreme Court had the 10th lowest unanimity rate. It was one of the most contentious courts in the United States. It only decided 66.1% of its cases unanimously, and we identified it as one of the most contentious courts in the nation. We also had a pretty clear dissenting minority come about on the court throughout the patterns that we observed. A pretty clear determining majority came out, and we had a notable lone dissenter in Jeffrey Slaughter. So there was a lot more disagreement on that court than you would think. And then if you go to Washington, you would expect, I had the same expectations going into Washington. You have a slew of Democrats on the court. So you think that there's going to be all agreement on the court. Well, the Washington Supreme Court was even less unanimous than the Indiana Supreme Court, despite all of the sort of ideological consistency that you would expect out of justices who have all Democratic confidence scores, except for one indeterminate on the court. Yet the Washington Supreme Court had the fourth lowest unanimity rate in the country. 59.1% of all cases were decided unanimously. So very low. It was one of the most contentious courts in the country. So Indiana and Washington, not so different after all.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you had a chance to look at this, or if this is maybe another phase in some research, but I wonder if having all of the justices or a strong majority of justices aligned with one particular party maybe gives more freedom for them to have more of these disputes within themselves than they would necessarily if there were judges from both parties. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And that's actually the way that I'm sort of tending more, the more that I think about these things, right? When you have a court that's composed with more justices of the same party, then the disagreements tend to be more pronounced, right? So that's another sort of fascinating thing that we saw, and it really struck me throughout the study. And it would definitely be an interesting thing to pursue in a next study for sure.
Yeah, the opportunities are kind of boundless here. All right,
Yeah.
and then I think you have one more major example, which looks at courts that have a strong partisan leaning, and what you found between those two, right?
Yeah. So the next thing that you might say, if I give you Indiana and Washington as an example of justices of the same party who disagree with each other, you might say, well, yes, but there's still some difference in between these states, right? So there's an indeterminate justice in Washington, and there are some strong Democrats and there are some mild Democrats. So surely there's going to be disagreement. The hypothesis might be, well, if you have all strong Republican or all strong Democratic justices, surely there will be more party cohesion, right? Well, let's look at Alabama really quickly. Alabama is the most Republican court in the country. All the justices on the Alabama Supreme Court are strong Republicans. We're charted strong Republican confidence scores in our study. Yet there was notable disagreement on the court. You saw opinion partners come through. You saw a lone dissenter in Justice Shaw. You saw several lone dissenters who are just frequently dissenting against the majority. And we actually saw a determining majority and a dissenting minority develop throughout the year too. So there was a lot more disagreement on the Alabama Supreme Court than I had expected there would be. Contrary to Alabama, you have Florida, a state that's actually more diverse. It's all Republican justices, one indeterminate justice, but you have two strong Republicans, and then you have mild Republicans and one indeterminate justice. And what you actually see is a lot more agreement among those justices, even though they they don't all seem to have the same partisan background. So that was really interesting to me. And in fact, the unanimity rate in Florida, it appears lower than it actually was. The reason that it was driven so low is largely in part because of Justice LaBarga dissenting or acting as a lone dissenter frequently throughout the year. So in Florida, we didn't have any opinion partners develop. We didn't have any determining majority, and we didn't have any dissenting minority. So the point is, I suppose, that these states are just very unique, and state courts are very unique. And in order to truly understand them, you have to dive into the specifics of the courts.
Yeah, that's just fascinating. As you say, you have two courts that would seemingly behave completely the opposite of how they are, just in terms of how those patterns of justices getting together for making decisions and dissenting opinions and that kind of thing. And you have Alabama operates completely differently than you would expect, and Florida operates, also differently than you'd expect. So it really is a fascinating area to look at, and it also really shows, again, how cases matter, points of law matter, and the specifics of what we're talking about can really drive a lot of these decision making.
Absolutely.
All right.
So what are my main? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, so what are the main takeaways, I guess, is the next point, right? Like, what do we take from all of this? Is it true that we just don't know anything and we just have to turn away and continue to ignore state Supreme Courts? My first takeaway would be that there is a huge conflict between the writing and the reality of the state courts. And we need to do a better job of bringing the writing and the research about state Supreme Courts and the reality together. And that's largely what we're trying to do with this project, and what we're continuing to try to do with all aspects of American politics here at Ballotpedia. So that's my first real takeaway. My second takeaway is that the courts are an incredibly complex political institution, and they need to be treated as such, right? The reason that our writing and our reality is out of step is because we're not treating them with the complexity that they deserve to be treated with. To convey the truth about these courts, we need to move beyond speaking about mere partisanship. It doesn't accurately convey what's going on in the courts. And I don't pretend to argue that 1 year of data on these courts solves the problem, right? This is a matter of a continual effort to continue to delve into the cases themselves and the way that the justices are ruling together, and find a way to make it easy and accessible for voters. So we need to treat the courts as the incredibly complex political institutions that they are. And my third takeaway is that this complexity should be celebrated. A lot of the time when we look at complex political institutions, we're daunted by them. And perhaps we look at them and we say, oh, democracy just isn't worth it, and self-government just isn't worth it. In reality, that's not what a lot of really smart people have thought about institutions like the courts. Alexander Hamilton, for instance, believed that the courts were really important, and the composition of the courts was really important because it rendered them the least dangerous branch, because they were least likely to act politically. They were most likely to remain neutral because of their complexity. Alexis de Tocqueville, a French traveler and aristocrat coming to study the United States political system and democracy in America, he went so far as to say that democracy in America in large part depended upon the rule of law, the courts, judges, and lawyers, and the sort of character that they brought to the American experiment. So we should celebrate the fact that the state courts are so complex and so interesting and so hard to pin down, because largely what that means is they're insulated from partisanship, and they were supposed to be.
Yeah, this is an area, as I mentioned at the beginning, where people really have a lot of interest, and we get evidence of that interest at Ballotpedia all the time. And I think you've answered a lot of questions with this work, but you've also raised a whole bunch more, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes. We did have some questions, and I wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit on those. So, for example, we have one question asked if you could elaborate a little bit more on the process that you went by to identify judges where they were not elected judges. So when you were looking at folks that maybe were appointed, what kind of factors did you use to determine kind of their political makeup?
Yeah, that's a great question. Admittedly, these were a lot more difficult to come up with partisan political information on. So there are a number of factors that still hold, right? Endorsements for office. You see a lot of endorsements from partisans. A lot of these justices, you don't just come out of nowhere and decide to be a justice, right? So a lot of these justices do have a partisan history, even if they were appointed. So we look at whether they've held other partisan offices in the past. We look at if it's a gubernatorial appointment state, we look at the party of the governor who appointed them. We looked at the different causes that the justice had previously donated to, whether they donated to partisan candidates frequently. those are just a number of things that we looked at. And this, in large part, was something that we found that we needed to correct from the Stanford study in 2012, was that they could really only give data on the justices from election states. And we wanted to find a way to give some information on justices from the states that weren't judicial election states. So yeah, that was a tough problem to come up with a solution to. And I don't pretend to say that we had the perfect solution, but we tried really hard to get all the data that we could to record some accurate numbers.
All right, yeah, thank you for that. And I guess, another question that I'm seeing is, how hard was it to go through all of these, as you mentioned, like 8,300 decisions? Some of these really turn on some very fine points of law. Like how challenging was that to actually kind of sift through and get a sense as to, where the judges were lining up on these decisions?
Well, 8,303 perhaps is an inflated number. Our job was made a lot easier because, as you saw, Washington had a unanimity rate of 59.1. So our job was made a lot easier by the fact that there were a lot of unanimous opinions. So we didn't have to sort out the way that justices stood in cases that were unanimous. So that cut out a lot of the really heavy lifting from a lot of the cases that we read. But it did become somewhat of a labyrinth when you sat down and you looked at the way that the justices ruled in all these different cases. The interesting thing that I found is that no two states have a similar format for logging judicial opinions. It's fascinating. And every single justice also has a different style of writing too. So you would go from one state to studying another state, and they would record opinions completely differently. In some states, you would have the majority and the minority at the very top of the opinion before it was written. And in some states, they wouldn't even list who was in the majority and who was in the minority. You would just have to figure out the method to their madness. So that was the really difficult thing to figure out. But largely what we did was we were trying to keep ourselves to pretty narrowly focusing on the way that justices ruled in specific cases. So luckily, we didn't have to deal with a whole lot of matters of law. But I will say that in the first few pages of our report that we published, we have what we identified as the contentious courts. So those were the courts that had what they would sound like, had the most disagreement on them in 2020. And for each of those courts, we actually wrote a summary of the case. And that became particularly difficult. I remember writing New York, and I had to pick up a little bit of real estate law along the way. So that was not the most fun thing in the world, but it was certainly fascinating.
All right. Well, I've had a chance to go through both of the reports, both last year's and this year's. They're incredibly comprehensive. They're a fascinating read. They're pretty thick, and we invite any reader that are interested in this to go. We have those on our website, and you can see all of the information for yourself. It really goes through the methodology in a lot of great detail. You find a lot of fascinating nuggets, and it's just incredibly well done. So thank you very much, Sam, for taking the time and walking us through all this today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. I hope you enjoyed this look at partisanship on each of the various state Supreme Courts, and basically an analysis of what partisanship really means when we're talking about state Supreme Courts, as opposed to in a legislative or even an executive branch sense. So if you're new to Ballotpedia, this type of research is an example of the kind of analyses that we do on all sorts of political topics. For example, just this month, we released an analysis on how changes in state legislative seats unfolded during the Trump presidency. And we also took a look before it happened of the breakdown of how the Virginia Republican Party was going to hold their unassembled convention, basically, how that whole process was going to work. And that's in addition to all of the great content that we have here at Ballotpedia. So to stay connected with all the things we do, you're going to want to do one of two things, or both. One is to regularly visit our homepage, and that's ballotpedia.org. And that's where we're going to feature the latest political news, along with links to all of our major coverage areas and our analyses. And you'll see them frequently spread throughout our homepage. And then the other way to stay informed is through our newsletters. Our newsletters cover a wide variety of topics, from election policy to Bold Justice, which is our newsletter about the federal courts, and everything else in between. There's a link on our homepage where you can see our full listing of newsletters, where you can subscribe and view sample issues. And if you've never subscribed to our newsletters, let me recommend two of them to get you started. One is our flagship daily political news summary called the Daily Brew. And the other is our weekly news recap that comes out on Saturdays, which is the TAP. There's a federal version and also one for state and local politics. So like I said, if you click on the link on our homepage, you can review those samples, subscribe to whichever ones you like. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day, everyone.